Hi everyone, it's Professor Todd with an introduction to Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. In this video we will talk briefly about the novel itself and provide a little bit of context and an introduction to some of the central themes. And we will also talk about the first section of the novel, the autumn section. So Toni Morrison was a very prolific writer, certainly considered one of the most important African American writers of the 20th century, and The Bluest Eye was her first novel, written in 1970. The Bluest Eye was actually set in the 1940s in Lorain, Ohio, and it follows an 11-year-old black girl named Pecola Breedlove, who is the protagonist of the novel. There are certainly some similarities here between Pecola and Morrison. Morrison was also born in Lorain, Ohio, and she would have been an 11-year-old girl in the 1940s. So there are certainly some parallels that are often drawn between the experiences perhaps Morrison had at that time and the experiences of Pecola. Most notably, these are the experiences really shared by any young black girl at the time who would have experienced the same kind of oppression, racism, and sort of life difficulties that we see with Pecola, and also with two of our other central characters, Claudia and Frida McTeer, also young, poor black girls, certainly not living in poverty the way that Pecola is, but also themselves fairly disadvantaged. This brings us to one of the really central themes of the novel, and that is the way in which oppression and sort of systematic racism affects young black women, right? So they lack agency not only because they are black in a society that deems whiteness as superior and that provides more power to white people, but they also lack agency because they are female in a society that values male, and because they are young in a society that values age, right? And because they are poor in a society which values wealth. So they have a variety of ways in which their agency and independence and voices are restricted. And we see that functioning in the novel in a variety of ways. So let's start with kind of this first section of Autumn. And in this section, we're introduced to our central characters. And one of the first things that we see is this motif of white beauty. And that kind of fits in with the larger theme of exploring the impact of societal or institutional racism. But in this particular instance with the young girls, we see the way in which they internalize and or rebel against the idea that whiteness is beautiful. So with both Pecola and Frida, we see this function early on with the Shirley Temple cup and the idealization of Shirley Temple, who was herself kind of this young, cherubic, blonde, ringlet, blue-eyed media persona, right? Certainly an actual person, but the persona of Shirley Temple created really is symbolic of everything that tells young people what is beautiful, what is ideal. And because these young girls, because Claudia and Frida and Pecola will never be able to obtain that, right? They are always left feeling less than or having feelings of self-loathing, right? So Claudia is interesting because in contrast to Frida and Pecola, Claudia doesn't initially internalize this belief. So she actually dislikes Shirley Temple, and she expresses how much she dislikes Shirley Temple, and also that extends to the white doll that Claudia is given, another sort of symbol. The adults even kind of engage in this perpetuation of this stereotype by giving her the white doll, right? Because that's what they think she'll want. That's what they think is beautiful. That's what they think is ideal. And Claudia actually dismembers that doll. She rips it apart, takes it apart, wants to know what it is about this doll that's so special, because as she says, she has not yet reached the place in her development where she believes that this white doll is beautiful. Because we get this sort of narrative perspective of Claudia looking back on her childhood as an adult, she has the now adult mentality that she knows she will eventually internalize that, but she's looking back on this point in her life when she had not yet bought into that belief and kind of seeing how that belief slowly became part of her identity. On the other hand, Pecola and Frida have already internalized that. So they do worship Shirley Temple. And later, when we see Pecola go to the store to try to get candy and she wants the Mary Janes, and she talks about the beauty of the little white girl in the Mary Jane candy wrapper, again, she is consuming, literally, right, wanting to consume the candy. She drinks the milk from the Shirley Temple cup. So she's actually consuming and internalizing that idea, that white ideal of beauty, right? And that, of course, ultimately damages her. We talk about, or the novel talks about, there's the scene where her parents are fighting and she's trying to will herself away down to just her eyes, and talking about how much she wants blue eyes, right? Because again, blue eyes represent that whiteness, that white standard of beauty. There are other sort of motifs that we see that play into that, like the Dick and Jane narrative that is at the beginning of each chapter. That's another way in which Morrison is sort of reinforcing this ideal. So we meet these characters who are young. We also see the way in which they're sort of disempowered because of their age, right? No one, the adults kind of dismiss them or don't listen to them. They tell them that they need to be quiet when they're taking on the new border, right? The girls are supposed to be seen and not heard, or really not even seen nor heard. And so that's another way in which they don't have a voice or agency in society, right? Their voice is suppressed because they're Black. It's also suppressed because of their age. We're introduced to their poverty, particularly the Breedlove's poverty, when we see their house, which is actually a storefront, right? They don't have even a real home, and their makeshift home is filled with angst and anger and fighting. And so that poverty also marks them. And we're even told in the novel that the Breedloves are ugly, not because they're objectively ugly, but because they believe that they're ugly, right? They have internalized this inferiority. They have internalized this belief that they are lesser than, that they are ugly. And that really impacts every aspect of their life, right? For Mrs. Breedlove, it makes her crave the abuse of her husband, right, in order to martyr herself. And for Charlie, we see that he too has been the victim of racism, right? The story that we're given of his background when he's having sex for the first time or at a very young age, and the white men come upon him, and they make him continue while they watch for their pleasure and for their amusement. And we are told that Charlie doesn't take his anger out on them. He takes it out on the girl that he's having sex with, because this is an indication of the power structure, right? Charlie is not able to take his anger out on the white men. That's not possible for him, right? And so because of his position of having a lack of power over those men, he looks for the people that he does have power over. So because he's Black, he's not as powerful as the white men are. But because he's a male, he's more powerful than Black women, and particularly young Black women. So he takes his anger out on women and on children, because those are the only people that he is able to take his anger out on. And this really shows kind of the pervasiveness and the generational impact of these institutionalized kind of racism, sexism forms of oppression. So this is just kind of a brief introduction to some of the central themes and ideas that I want you to look at as you read this first section, and as you get to know these characters. Really think about the way in which Morrison starts kind of crafting this narrative and showing how pervasive and systemic and generational all of these beliefs are, all of these stereotypes, all of these forms of oppression, and the way in which all of that culminates and falls down on these young, poor Black girls like Pecola, and like Morrison herself was. Okay, so in the next video, we'll be discussing the next section, which is winter.